Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of P&P, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. And we have what promises to be quite an engaging event for you this evening with Larry Krasner talking about his new memoir, For the People. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the event, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat function, also at the bottom, is not for asking questions, but chatting. And in that box, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of For the People. Larry, of course, is the district attorney of Philadelphia, a post he was elected to in November 2017, which was particularly newsworthy at the time and remained significant because before then, Larry's 30-year career as a lawyer had been in criminal defense and civil rights. As he says in the introduction of his book, that was as far from the work of a criminal prosecutor as a lawyer could be. And he had a long record of joining with other system outsiders to push for justice against insiders in the DA's office. So by running a long shot campaign 4 years ago and actually winning, Larry led the outsiders into becoming insiders and quickly became the most prominent reformer DA in the country. His book, For the People, is about how he got there, and more broadly, how and why our criminal justice system got so broken, and what needs to be done to fix it. Larry, by the way, is now in the final weeks of another tough election campaign ahead of next month's Democratic primary. He faces some opposition from police unions and others, upset with the increased crime rate in Philadelphia and Larry's reform agenda, which has included the no prosecutions for marijuana possession or sex work, no cash bail for most prisoners, and a refusal to seek the death penalty. A lot to talk about this evening. Larry will be in conversation with DeRay Mckesson, a leading civil rights activist and community organizer who has advocated widely for victims of police violence and for an end to mass incarceration. He hosts the podcast, Pod Save the People, and is the author of On the Other Side of Freedom, an essay collection published 3 years ago, reflecting on lessons learned about resistance, justice, freedom, and accountability, and about how to change our flawed societal structures to reduce racism and provide for a better world. So Larry and DeRay, the screen is yours.
It is so good to be here. It's good to be back at Politics and Prose. So thanks for hosting us. And Larry, it's always great to be in conversation. Let's jump right in because I have so many things to talk about with the book. Let's start at the beginning. I didn't know until I read this book that you had only like 90-ish days left till election day when you decided to run. What was that like? That's such a wild thing to run. Like a 90-ish day campaign is unheard of, and to have been successful in the way you were. What was going through your mind when you made that decision?
Well, the campaign was 98 days, but I had spent a little bit of time thinking about it. For me, my career has been kind of this series of surprises, and they weren't entirely good. I got into criminal justice with the idea that the system was okay. And if I did really good, hard work on either side, I would be advancing things. There would not be as many mistakes. But the longer I hung around, and I was a very busy trial lawyer for 30 years, the more I saw these characters, these judges who were more criminal than some of the defendants, police officers who were doing things that were unconscionable. And these stories just kind of stuck with me. So even though I had never thought about running, being a politician, being a chief prosecutor, I got to the age of 56. I saw the usual suspects, by which I mean the likely candidates to run for DA. They were all pretty much coming at it from the same direction: more years of incarceration, higher charges, longer sentences, that kind of thing. I couldn't take it. I just found that at age 56, I felt like I hadn't really had any serious impact. I had done good work for individuals, but the system got worse the whole time. And I just felt like I needed to run. Now, I will say this, like, in fairness, do not think this was a leap off the cliff. I have been representing activists for a very long time as a professional hobby. because what you do with activists in Philly is you lock them up and then you try to keep them in jail, because that's what you do to people who want nonviolent social change and want to improve the world, right? That's what was going on. So I knew I had some friends. I knew that I had helped some people who were very, very persuasive and knew how to win battles. I didn't go into it completely blind, but I went into it thinking I would lose. And I went into it thinking that on the other side of this election, there'd be a lot of payback coming for me. And, fortunately, I was right that a lot of these activists had a tremendous sphere of influence, that if you copied some of the lessons that I had learned from ACT UP, for example, in its early days about communication, we could run a different way. And we ended up winning in a landslide. We actually won with more votes than any DA candidate in Philly in at least 20 years. So this is that story. The book does not talk about my time in office. The book talks about running and everything I was thinking and all the stories I was telling and all the things I was remembering and what was being said to me on that trail. And I would like to think it's less a memoir and it's more a book of true stories about things that other people experienced and that I saw.
Well, you are modest. 90 days is still not a long time to execute a campaign. I mean, that is definitely the sprint, and you did it. But you also weren't new to elections, even in your own home, because not only do you talk about this at the beginning of the book, but you talk about your partner of 30-ish years who was an elected judge. What was that? What was it like to, you write in the book that she couldn't even come to the announcement because of her role in her role as a judge. What were the lessons? Were there any lessons that you learned from being a part of her campaign, like the first time, or what was that? I'm just so curious about what it was like to run knowing that there was a judge at home.
Well, that there is a chapter in here called Lisa Taught Me Politics, which is about how we both learned. She learned more quickly than me because she was on the trail, but we both learned not to overestimate machine politics and not to overestimate political parties. At the time that she ran, which was about 20 years ago, the Democratic Party in the city of Philadelphia was a machine. It was centrist. It was pretty strong. But the thing it was strongest at is the thing that most political parties are strongest at doing, which is convincing you that you can't beat them. They are really good at persuading you that they hold the power, they are the gatekeeper, and you have to go through them. Not so much, and one of the things that we talk about in the book is actually a list of rules and things that we learned. Some of it's actually quite simple. Some of it is just sort of like, well, okay, figure out where people vote and figure out the places where most people vote, and then figure out how many people love you and put them there to tell people to vote for you. Because as it turns out, people who actually love you and who are persuasive are going to do better at the polls than a party functionary who's never heard of you and is, mostly there for a couple dollars and the social life, right? Things like that. But what she found, and she was an amazing insurgent candidate in part because she had been a military child. So she moved a lot from place to place, new school every couple of years. She had lived overseas. Her father was actually a pilot, career military pilot, and she lived in Afghanistan as a young child. So she had to go into places where they'd never seen her before and come out of that room doing okay. And when later in life she ran for judge, it turned out she was an absolutely fabulous insurgent politician. The party watched how well she did. She nearly won the first time out of the blue with terrible ballot position. They watched what she did and they decided that they were better off being on her side, because to be beaten by an insurgent disproves their illusory power. And there were lessons in there that we never forgot. And that 20 years later, I was willing to bring back around. And it had a lot to do, I think, with the techniques that we used and how we were able to win.
And how does that relate to, you have that whole section about Frank Rizzo and Frank's legacy and machine politics and you wanting to sort of fight against those things. Have you been able to sort of fight against that legacy of the Rizzo world that was so much of the foundation, as you talk about, of a political machine in Philadelphia?
Well, we have been able to fight against it. Times have changed somewhat, but the truth is that Frank Rizzo, who was a brutal racist beat cop and then became a brutal racist police commissioner and then became our brutal racist mayor, has a very long shadow. And that shadow remains with the Philadelphia Police Department. There are generations that were hired and trained and have the values of Frank Rizzo still. But we've gotten to the point in Philly where when I started to write this book, there was a big Frank Rizzo statue right across from City Hall, the only statue of a mayor anywhere near City Hall. That statue is gone now. It was actually removed during the protests around George Floyd. It had become such a target because of its symbolic significance, because it was our Confederate general. It had become such a target that police were spending, frankly, a lot of resources to protect this statue when there were much more important things going on. It's gone now, and that says something. There used to be a giant mural of Frank Rizzo in his stronghold in South Philly, a place that is often called the Italian Market. It's, for those of you who remember the movie Rocky, it's where he's running up the street, and you have the 55-gallon drums with flames coming out of it, and fruit vendors and such in the street. Well, that mural, the most defaced mural in a city of 4,000 murals for more than a decade because of what he stood for, that mural was painted over as well. So Philadelphia has changed. Its police union, not really. And some of its retired officers, not really. And some of its current officers, not really. Although there's no question that with our current police department, it is more modern in its active membership. It is more diverse. It's getting better, but it has a long way to go.
Well, I do want to ask about, I want to talk about jury service and the death penalty, but we'll come back to that. Since we're talking about policing, you obviously live in this world, and you've seen that this week has been these past 2 weeks have been weeks where the conversation about police violence is back as the national conversation. I'd love to know both what's your take on sort of what's going on right now, and then what is your relationship with the police union, the police department, and how does that figure in as a progressive prosecutor, as somebody who said up front, like, I don't believe in just putting people in cages. I do believe in holding officers accountable. Like, how does that all actually just work together, given that you're in the seat with power?
So big week, we heard guilty 3 times. And for many of us, it was very encouraging. It was very hopeful. Yes, it's only a drop in a giant bucket of injustice, but we heard that. And that was a good thing to hear. I can say that. My history as an attorney was 25 years out of the 30 of also being a civil rights lawyer for people who were framed by police, who had violence used against them by police. And so for me, this is a topic that has been of interest for a very long time. We couldn't even get through this trial without having people killed under inexcusable circumstances by uniformed police officers. It's a big concern. And I have to tell you that one of the nice things about ending up in office, having the levers of power, is that it's not somebody else deciding whether a police officer in Philadelphia will be charged with killing an unarmed Black man. It's me. And so we have had 2 of them. We have 2 cases now in which we have charged police officers with murder that involved the killing of a Black man who was unarmed at the time he was shot and killed. And, there's a little heat coming from that because that's not what we do in Philly. There has not been a single case of that type that has gone to trial in Philadelphia in as long as I can remember, and both of our cases are going to trial. So there's a lot of heat. Where does it come from? Well, you identified it. It's very important for us to distinguish between a police officer, more specifically the current police department, and the heads of their unions. They're not identical. For example, in Philly, 2/3 of the membership of our Fraternal Order of Police, as they call it, are retired. And because they are retired, you are talking about people who came up much more in the shadow of Frank Rizzo. They are much closer to what they used to be. We have a city that has 7 Democrats for every Republican. Our city hates Donald Trump, but the FOP endorsed him twice. The leadership of the FOP has always been white. It has always been male, and it has always been Republican, which is obviously in stark contrast to what the city is. More to the point, to get real specific about it, the leader of the FOP in Philly has referred to Black Lives Matter as a, quote, pack of rabid animals, unquote. He's not mincing his words. You got to say that for him. He has also defended a police officer visibly wearing a Nazi tattoo while in uniform. And this is someone whose FOP hall has entertained the Proud Boys, who came into the officers only area and drank beers with the fellas. A fact he denied until the Proud Boys put it up on social media. So let me be direct about this. I'm not going to get along with that man. It would be immoral for me to get along with that man. My father served in World War II. Do I need to say more? This is not what we're going to do. But that does not mean that all of our current police officers or our commissioner feels that way. Commissioners sometimes are very much at odds with the heads of these unions, because some commissioners actually do want to fire police officers. They want to terminate them. They want to move them. They want to discipline them. And at almost every turn, these commissioners are pushed back. In many ways, if you look at Derek Chauvin, what you realize is he should have stopped being a cop a very long time before he ever came in contact with George Floyd. And I would like to think, in light of the fact that the police chief in the Twin Cities, Ariando, in light of the fact that he actually did something very unusual, which is he took the stand and he testified against a police officer who was charged with crimes. I would like to think that maybe with different leadership and with different structures that do not always put arbitrators in the mix who fix the thing, that we could have had a world where Chauvin stopped being a cop a long time before he had a chance to kill George Floyd.
And there's a chapter in the book that is about policing, and there's these stories that it blew my mind. The story about the officer who got his wife arrested. Can you talk, like, that was so wild. I was like, and you wrote about it, like, I can only imagine how much corruption you saw on the other side as a defense attorney, and were essentially powerless. And now you are you're on this side and have so much power. But that story about the police officers sort of using their police power in domestic disputes, it actually gels with the data. The data says that about 40% of police homes actually experience domestic abuse. But I was surprised to hear this story in the book.
Sure. Well, I have to tell you, I was pretty shocked. As a criminal defense attorney, I did not expect a woman who is the wife of a police officer to come to me charged with 2 different felonies and explain to me that the supposed victim of these felonies was her husband, a police officer who had arrested her during divorce proceedings. It happened. I know it's stunning, but it actually happened twice. I had 2 separate cases in which the wife of a police officer came to me. One of them was charged with 2 separate felony cases. The other was charged with 1. But the bottom line was this: these 2 women caught their husbands cheating. In one case, for the second time, they wanted divorces. And as they went into divorce proceedings, all of a sudden, their estranged husbands are literally locking them up. And there is no oversight within the police department saying, what the hell are you doing walking your wife in here and accusing her of all these things? The entire department went along with it as if it was fine. I had to try criminal cases for both of these women. Both of them were acquitted on all 3 cases. And after we did that, we filed lawsuits. What I was seeing was not just the criminal charges. It was the purpose of the criminal charges. When these women went to family court, and when they were in the middle of divorce proceedings, they were, of course, deciding who gets the house. They were deciding how much will alimony be. They were deciding how much is child support, who gets custody, how much. The purpose of the charges was to go into family court and to leverage them so that the police officer had an advantage. And what makes this all even worse is that those officers walked into family court with a lawyer provided by the Fraternal Order of Police, who was 100% complicit and sometimes explicit in saying, well, if you'll just do what your husband wants, then these criminal charges will go away. So we filed lawsuits. We're successful in both of them, but maybe the most jaw-dropping aspect of the whole jaw-dropping thing is that we were going to settle one of the lawsuits, and I said, hey, listen, she doesn't just want money. We want to have a policy in the police department that if you're going to walk your lover, your business partner, your spouse, the parent of a child, ... if you're going to arrest these people who have these important roles in your life, it is an obvious potential conflict. We need to have high-level supervision, take a look at it before the cuffs are on. The answer I got from the lawyers for the city was, no, we just rather pay you more money because there's no negotiating with the police union on these kinds of things. A lot of times we talk about the most grievous incidents. We talk about something like what happens to George Floyd, or we talk about the death penalty in a homicide case. Some of the biggest truths are in looking at what happens with misdemeanor cases that are criminal cases, but because they actually affect a lot more people. Some of the bigger truths are looking at all the smaller ways, the sweeping smaller ways in which a vacuum of accountability and policing has allowed this to go on, and also to understand where Derek Chauvin gets these ideas. Well, if it's that kind of a culture, I think we know where he gets these ideas.
Now, when we sort of put this tenure in the sort of realm of Philly DAs, you really do seem like an aberration. That there was a DA who was really excited about the death penalty and sort of had a record, and then there were some obviously corrupt ones before her. How has the death penalty factored into the way you think about your responsibility and your role? Like, how has that shaped the way you even thought about what it meant to be a lawyer?
Well, I've had a pretty wild ride with the death penalty because my first contact with it was when I was 23 years old. I was just out of college, had not decided what I really want to do with my life, and I got picked to serve as a juror on a death penalty case right outside of Philadelphia. This was a pretty terrible case. It was a rape murder of an older woman, and it was not a whodunit. Her son happened to be an FBI agent. And so the area was flooded with FBI personnel right after she was found. The house was half burned down on her. And within 24 hours, they found the man who did it in a nearby motel. He had her stolen car, and he had left his thumbprint on the mirror of the car in her blood. So, it was not so much about whether he was guilty or not. It had more to do with what was going to happen with the death penalty. It was such a high publicity case that the judge sequestered us, much like they did in the Chauvin trial, meaning we lived in a hotel. We didn't go home. We weren't supposed to communicate with the public. And as soon as we went out to deliberate on the guilt phase, because there are two different phases. The first phase is whether this person is guilty, and if so, to what degree. And the second phase, if you find someone guilty of first-degree murder, is to determine whether there should be a death sentence or not, right? So we're going out to start deliberating after a week or so on trial. And one of our quieter members stands up and he pulls a little Bible out of his back pocket and he holds it. He's holding it upside down and he opens it and we're looking at it, trying to figure out what's going on. And he starts to mumble this thing about who am I to judge another person, which is confusing because at the beginning of jury selection, they always ask you, do you have a religious belief that would interfere with your ability to make a decision? And you don't get on the jury unless you say, no, I can make a decision. I don't have a religious belief that would do that. So he pulls this out and starts to do it. We're all kind of surprised. We quickly found out when he was removed from the jury by the judge that what had occurred is he had serious mental illness for which he was medicated. He had not disclosed that during jury selection, even though he was asked. He denied using medication. He also denied having mental health issues. He apparently had no idea that he would be sequestered. And then once he was placed in a hotel, he had no access to his medication. So over the period of about a week, he started to decompensate more and more. And I had noticed something odd the night before. I saw him looking at a menu upside down for a moment, but none of us thought that he had any mental illness or anything until he does this. And he was then removed, right? I would like to tell you that's the only odd thing that happened in that jury room. No, it's not. There was an explicitly racist comment that was made in which a guy with a cowboy hat and a big belt buckle. Now, this is Pennsylvania, so we don't all wear cowboy hats and big belt buckles, but a guy who thought he was from Texas, but was from Pennsylvania said, you know what we're all here for. We're here to get this boy. And yes, it was an African-American defendant. There were other comments made between jurors when we had some disputes that were explicitly hateful comments having to do with race and ethnicity. And, so during that experience, it became really obvious to me that the mechanism by which we decide who should live or die is not perfect. We came back in and we delivered a verdict of guilty in the first degree, fully expecting that we would go out and we would have to deliberate on the issue of a death sentence or not. But we didn't, because
It's
when
an 11-person jury, is that a thing? How does that, did they replace him? I mean, you write about it in the book, but how does that?
in Pennsylvania, you do not, at that time at least, you did not replace them. And what happened is there was a deal between the defense attorney and the prosecutor, maybe the only good thing the defense attorney did, which was, yes, we'll take a verdict of 11 jurors, but in exchange for that, the prosecution will not seek the death penalty. And the prosecution cut that deal. I mean, the truth is at that point, it was a high publicity case that had cost the county a bunch of money. And I don't think they wanted to start over, which should cause you to think even further about how just or unjust the death penalty was, that they didn't want all that much if it cost a couple dollars, right? But, we were all a little bit concerned, but as it turned out, we did not have to go and come to a verdict. Fast forward, yes, I did death penalty cases as an attorney. Fast forward, yes, as a prosecutor, I faced decisions about whether or not we are going to pursue the death penalty. But one thing I never lost was the realization of how imperfect our system is and how questionable it is to have people who are so imperfect make decisions about the ultimate penalty that are really irrevocable.
I wanted to ask you too, because I never asked you. I know we've talked a ton, but I've always been curious about how do cases get to you? Like, given the amount of things that people get charged with crimes, it seems impossible that you will review every single case that a prosecutor in your office has. What rises to the level where you, as the DA, actually have to weigh in?
Great question. There have been times when Philly processed 70,000 cases a year. That is about 200 new cases a day. And we are now at about half that, but still, you're talking 100 plus cases a day. There's no way in the world I can see every case. I don't see everything I should see. Sometimes things happen that are not what I would like, but you try to set up supervision that is decent and policies that provide enough guidance and that require that certain things be advanced and considered by me, either because they are of great magnitude or because they seem to be such an aberration from what you're trying to do in general. For a very long time, I tried to look at basically every single homicide case, and I still look at a lot of them. I try to look at every case where, the prosecutors feel it deserves more than 15 years in jail if it's a homicide case now. But we also try to look at other cases. Sometimes it's brought to your attention by an attorney. Sometimes it's brought to your attention by the press. And I'm not going to kid you. There's no way in the world that we can look at every single case, but we try to look for the important ones.
And why homicide case? Like, why do homicide case? Like, what are you looking for when you look at a homicide case? Are you going in saying, I don't know, like, what is he? I'm just curious. This is like, how often do we get to talk to a real DA?
Sure. Well, why homicide cases? First of all, because the homicide unit in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office and the homicide unit of the police department were among the most corrupt units in Philadelphia for many, many years. My office has now exonerated 18 people, all but one were in homicide cases, and we've done that in 3 years. Those 18 people, with very, very few exceptions, I can tell you absolutely were completely 100% innocent. And the people who committed those terrible crimes got away because innocent people sat in jails for decades. I got a problem with that. And what that meant when I came in is I had a problem with some of the people who were still in that unit, some of whom I fired, some of whom I transferred out of there. But their values lived on, their win at all cost values, their bizarre interpretation of the requirement that prosecutors turn over helpful information to the defense lived on. And I had to break that. I had to break that in half. So part of what I did was to bring in new personnel, new supervision. Part of what I did was to bring in a bunch of new attorneys, but a lot of what I had to do is keep my eyes on it. Now, those are also the cases in which you're looking at massive numbers of years, so it does affect mass incarceration. And there are also cases in which the victims and the survivors have suffered terribly, the survivors and homicides, but they've suffered terribly. And so I thought, it was very important in terms of modeling in the office. It's a very prestigious unit for some people. In terms of modeling, they need to see what you're willing to do in those cases. So that was a lot of it. There are other things I really dedicated myself to. One of them was the resentencings of over 100 juvenile lifers. Philadelphia was the city that was the world's epicenter of juvenile lifer sentencing.
And you just have the power as a DA to resentence, or like you can start the process?
Well, after the United States Supreme Court said that, number one, you cannot execute people who are involved in a homicide when they are juveniles, and number two, that they cannot simply be given a mandatory life without parole sentence, which went on, of course, for decades. But after the Supreme Court said that not so long ago, thanks to Brian Stevenson, there had to be nationally resentencings of a whole bunch of people, some of them in their 60s, 70s, but many of them younger than that, who've been sitting in jail ever since they were juveniles and believed they would never leave jail. They all had to be resentenced. Philadelphia just had a huge number. And even during our administration, we had to conduct the resentencings of over 100 of them, right? We didn't set the sentence, but we would go in and make a recommendation to a judge, and the judge would determine the sentence in Philadelphia. And so what that meant was we had to look at everything that happened to the defendant before the crime. We had to look at what happened to the victim And the survivors, as a result of the crime, we had to look at the crime, and we had to look at everything that happened in the life of the defendant while incarcerated since that time. We had to get input from families who had suffered terribly 25 years earlier. And we're now being told the surprising news that there would be a resentencing. So it was a very, very intensive process, especially because in many instances, the original lawyers were so badly compensated that they had not gathered, even half the information that they needed for their clients. And I wanted to be in every one of those meetings. I thought it was incredibly important that I was in those meetings, and that as a group with a bunch of expertise in the room, we were able to make recommendations about what would happen. Now, the fascinating thing for me also, though, I will say this, is one of the things I learned in that process, and I think it's crucial for people to understand this, is that with all of these juvenile lifers coming out of custody, and a lot of them did come out of custody, there was very little crime that any of them committed. These were people who at age 15, we had decided were such monsters they should die in jail, either by being executed or just live out their natural lives and die in jail. That's who we thought they were. We had them identified as monsters, and yet they came out. And on most of the data that I see in Pennsylvania, they are less dangerous than an average sample of the population. You are safer, DeRay, in a room full of juvenile lifers than you are walking down the street. That's kind of an amazing thing. It calls into question really the cracked foundation of our entire criminal justice system, which is that you can know everything you know, everything you need to know about someone based on their involvement in a terrible crime. That criminality is static and that it's permanent. It's just wrong. It's not, I'm not being aspirational, I'm being scientific. On the numbers, it's just wrong. That's not who they are. They profoundly changed over time. And that is something that I think we should keep in mind as we reconsider what we do in criminal justice.
Now, to those who are listening, I want you to get ready with your questions, those who are participating tonight, so that when we transition to Q&A, you have thought about your questions, you get those questions in the Q&A box. That makes me think that is a good segue to, you start to, as the book progresses, you sort of zoom out and start to talk about the structural things. And one of the things that you spend some time on is helping us understand the danger of sentencing guidelines. And it seems like that also pushes up against the role of the judges and sort of the box that even progressive DAs like you, sometimes you're just in a box that is a bad box to be in. What has that been like? Have you been able to change those things, or do we need to collectively fight to make a better non-box like this?
We really do need to collectively fight. It is true that chief prosecutors are a pretty good entry point to try to start to change the system. But there's only so far that we are going to be able to go in this box where we have some terrible legislation, some terrible ideas like unscientific sentencing guidelines, where we have a terrible culture that really values punishment far more than it values things that will prevent the next victimization. If you want to prevent the next victim, then what you want is rehabilitation. What you want is prevention, because punishment does none of that, or next to none of that. And our whole adult criminal justice system has been premised on punishment. No, we have to change it. In Pennsylvania, for example, we have outdone the rest of the country. The rest of the country has seen a 500% increase in incarceration over the last 30 to 40 years. It makes us the most incarcerated country in the world. But Pennsylvania did even better. We're at about 750%. Hooray, Pennsylvania. How do we get there? Well, we had a bunch of people sit around a room and say, that seems like a really serious crime. So how about 48 months? No, 60 months. No, 72. Okay, that sounds good, Joe. Okay, thanks, Bill. This is how they came up with this stuff. And, has it made us safer? No, there's absolutely no indication that it's made us safer. But it has become this box where even the people we elect to be judges are not allowed to judge anymore. They have to work within some kind of a matrix written for them by people who are not in the system, who had no expertise, and often had financial and power motivations to fill their jails. A major part of much of Pennsylvania's economy in places where there used to be steel and there used to be coal has been prisons. So big surprise then that their legislators like mandatory sentences. They like high guidelines. They like to import Philadelphians to their jails up in Cole County and Carbon County and, places like that. Because what else do they have? This is going to be their tax base. They're going to get money in. They're going to get payroll going. They're going to have a tax base. They're going to have a diner that functions. They're going to have a public school, and it's all paid for in a familiar way. It's a trade in human beings who come from places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, often Black and brown people, and who will be in their jails.
I didn't know. So one of the last questions I asked before we go to the Q&A is I didn't know that there was a tradition of the incoming DA firing everybody or firing a lot of people. And that there's a part where you talk about those interviews and like meeting the interim person. What was it like to walk in knowing that there were a set of people in that office who were hell bent on you not getting elected, who actively worked against you? There were some people that you had worked with before and had a good relationship with, even if you disagree with them when you were a criminal defense attorney. And then there were some people sort of in the middle. What was that like?
Well, it was challenging. I mean, this was a situation in which I had spent 30 years. I had started at the same time as some of the senior people there. I tried cases against or with, depending on how you look at it. Many of them. I knew their reputations. I mean, in a sense, I had been interviewing them for 30 years. It's just that they didn't think, and I didn't think this was an interview because nobody ever thought I'd be in a position to make a judgment about whether they should stay in the office, be promoted, whatever. Some of those people were absolutely fabulous. Some of those people I advanced immediately to supervisory positions. They had been really good, decent people operating within a terrible office, and it was a terrible office for most of that time. Some of those people I fired. I fired about 30 people, almost all of them lawyers in an office of 600 and in a group of about 300 attorneys. And some of them are still suing me now, including the person running against me. Yes, that is
What are they
right.
suing you for? What did you like?
In almost every case, they claimed age discrimination. Whenever you're done laughing, let me know, because you may have noticed I'm like 60 years of age, and the first assistant I hired was 84. But anyway, they knew it was kind of absurd, with very few exceptions, to claim that I was discriminating based upon race or anything else, or gender, as a civil rights lawyer and what I stood for. So they all said it was age discrimination. I will say one of them, though, said I discriminated based on race. The allegation is I hate white people. I just thought I'd share that with you, DeRay.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. So, we fired some people. And the truth is, I could have fired a few more, because I was coming into an office where the dominant culture was entirely hostile to what we were trying to do. Fast forward 3 years, where are we now? We're at a point where I've actually hired most of the attorneys in the office. The culture is entirely different in many different ways. It's different because of training. It's different because of policy. It's different because of the personnel. And it's different because we've won a number of victories within the system that are significant. So it's changing. Not quite as bad, say, as it was when Nelson Mandela picked his chief prosecutor in South Africa to run the National Prosecutors Group, and that chief prosecutor had been imprisoned by his new employees for having a celebration of the birthday of Nelson Mandela. Now, that's a tough place to be, because he couldn't fire anybody. Not quite that bad, but it was not perfect. I did have the advantage, though, that I'm in a state where you can fire people. When you see these progressive prosecutors come into a situation that is civil service or where there are a lot of other rules that prevent you from firing and transferring people, it becomes easier for the old guard to hang on and to try to control the outcome.
Got it. Well, let us transition into some questions. This is the last question that I'll ask you. And this is a book question. What was it like to write a book? As somebody who went through this process, and Lord knows it was a lot for me. You have an incredibly tough job. What was it like to take some time and just like tell this story? Why a book? Why now?
So, part of the answer here is that I grew up in the house of an author. My father, William, was actually a writer and an author. After he was from an immigrant family. He comes out of the war after he volunteered, served in the Pacific. GI Bill takes him to Columbia University, and he does a not terribly practical thing, which is he gets a creative writing degree there. And he then published several novels and, lived the hard and difficult life of a professional author and writer. He he dealt with it in the home. I saw this as I grew up. I never really wanted to be an author or a writer myself, but I saw it in the home. So there's a little yearning on my part. Mostly what he wrote about was crime fiction. So there's a little yearning on my part. And then, I was approached, and there were a few different ideas. People were interested in writing about things that were more technical, but I wasn't really interested in writing something that was more technical and more specific about policy. I was much more interested in talking about this at the level of culture, in talking about in terms of stories. And I say that because representing so many activists and protesters, I had come to believe that the way society really changes is at the level of culture. It's not a particular law that passes unless people understand the issue, and unless they feel a certain way, it's not going to change. So what I wrote was much more a collection of the stories about things that I had heard and I had seen. This was usually on a Sunday because the job was not compatible with this being something that I worked on during the week. It was seldom compatible with my even getting 2 days in on the weekend, but it was compatible with skipping football time. It was compatible with skipping, some of my other old hobbies that I used to have. And of course, it went much more slowly than expected. I was sure I'd be able to write it in 6 months. I mean, 2 years is not that close to 6 months. So it took, I see you laughing, but anyway, it took quite a bit of time. And, but I will say this, for me, it turned out to be very supportive of my day job, because a lot of what politicians do, as you write about actually in your book, a lot of what they do is they communicate. And so when I went through the exercise of sitting for a few hours and really thinking about the words I wanted to use, the words I did not want to use, to talk about a topic, the stories I wanted to tell, the stories I did not want to tell, it put me in a position as I, hit the keyboard and engraved it, where it was kind of engraved in my brain. And when I was discussing something at work or speaking to a journalist, these words came back and these stories came back. So I found it to be very, very supportive of the job in that way, even though I didn't know that it would be.
Oh, well, let's go to questions. Here we go. So, okay, we have one question that says, I realize it may be difficult for you in some ways, but would you speak to the history of the MOVE organization in Philadelphia, the legacy of the systemic repression of their members, and more specifically, what can you say about the odyssey of Mumia Abu-Jamal? Does he deserve to be in jail after 40 years of arguably wrongful conviction, much of which he has been relegated to death row?
So I can't talk much about Mumia because it is a pending matter, other than to say, a lot of people misunderstand what the DA's power is. There have been people very concerned about the health of Mumia Abu-Jamal who seem to think that I actually have control over that. I do not. That is a matter that is within the control of the prison system. And so I get a lot of phone calls about that from concerned people, and I certainly respect their concern. There are other people who think that as a prosecutor, I can somehow reverse 40 years of litigation. This is a 40-year-old case. I can't do that. What I can do is respond to motions that are filed by the defense, as the law permits me to do. So let me just say that in terms of the legacy of MOVE, that is one of Philadelphia's great tragedies. It's something that I allude to actually in I think the first paragraph of the book. I talk about how Philadelphia got to be known as the city that bombed itself, because during one of the two MOVE confrontations, the police dropped C4 on the roof of a building and didn't just incinerate the building and a lot of people within it, but incinerated about 60 houses that surrounded it, when the city unconscionably told firefighters to stand down and let it burn. It is one of the really terrible things in the history of Philadelphia that says so much about Philadelphia. Philadelphia in many ways is a complete contradiction. It is a place with national parks that are dedicated to ideals of freedom. It is a place where tourists go to learn about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, in all of its, very flawed glory, but glory nonetheless. And at the same time, it ended up being a place that bombed itself. It ended up being a place where Frank Rizzo rose to power. It ended up being a place that, when I took office, was the most incarcerated of the 10 largest cities in the most incarcerated country in the world, and was also the most over-supervised on probation and parole of the 10 largest cities. It was simultaneously the poorest of the 10 largest cities. a fact that, in my opinion, is owed in part to how criminal justice was conducted in the city and how a city actually spiraled down because of its insatiable thirst for conviction and disqualifying people from participating in the economy and so on. So, there's a lot in this book that is specific to Philadelphia, because Philadelphia in some ways is such an archetype of criminal justice gone completely off the rails.
There's another question. This is like a shout out and a question. I'm really enjoying the PBS series on you. How did that come about and why did you cooperate?
Well, thank you so much. It's very kind of you. I would like to think it's not a series about me. I think that when people see the first episode, they might feel that way. But as you go through and you see the rest, you'll see that one of the great things these filmmakers did is they expanded the horizon and they introduced all of these characters within the office. Some of them, just really amazing people, like my first two assistants, including Bob Listenby, who was Barack Obama's chief of juvenile justice in his second term and is one of my first assistants. They show all of these characters who are trying to bring change. They show them in real time. They show them engaging with people within the office who don't necessarily agree. And that becomes another set of characters. And then they go outside the office and they engage with people who are in the system, a person who is on probation and parole, a judge who does not agree with us, police officers who are not always charitable towards what we're trying to do. So it becomes this very broad portrayal of a city and all of these different viewpoints and factors. And I'm glad, because it really shouldn't be about me. Why do we agree to do it? Well, it's actually a lot simpler than it might seem. These two filmmakers are in Philly, and that is Ted Passon and Yoni Brook, and also Nicole Salazar, who worked with them. But Ted and Yoni Brook are in Philly. Their studio, their professional filmmakers, is about a block from the Criminal Justice Center. They got interested in the campaign. And then when we got in office, they asked. At that point, I had no idea that it would become a big deal. It just seemed like a couple local filmmakers were interested in taking a look at whether we succeeded or failed. Obviously, I derived no profit from it. I had essentially zero editorial control over it. But I kind of felt like, there really is a national grassroots movement for criminal justice reform. It's now elected, at this point, it's elected 10% of the US has elected a progressive prosecutor. And I wanted people to see that you can get elected, that the party's telling you can't get elected. You can get elected. People out there right now who have never thought about running, you're probably the ones who should run. People who think too much about running got something wrong with them. You're probably the ones who should run it. Or if you yourself should not run, somebody who should, who is actually dedicated to the work and not as dedicated to their own ambition. So that was part of it. But I also wanted people to see, and I was hopeful we would succeed, but I wanted people to see what it looks like to try to change. So that would be demystified too. I actually saw permitting these filmmakers to follow us around and to do the docuseries as just being kind of a manual so that others could learn from our successes and mistakes, and that criminal justice reform could spread more quickly, spreading quickly enough, but it could spread more quickly as people realized what was possible and that you do not have to be exceptional to achieve these things.
Cool. I live in a city that has 6 police officers attend the January 6th insurrection, where the head of the police union is a known racist and is openly hostile to the mayor and the city council. It feels like we're trapped because we don't have the power to get rid of him to change the culture of the department. What steps can citizens take?
Wow. Well, one of the big steps that you can take is protest. It is free speech. Another big step you can take is vote. Another big step you can take, because yes, you can win elections. It may not seem like it, but yes, you can. It is absolutely doable. And one of the things we talk about in the book are just some rules about how you can do it. Another thing you can do is participate in those elections. You can be the insurgent or on the side of the insurgent. You can be creative. You can be original. You can make moves they didn't see were coming. And at the same time, you know exactly what their moves are because they never change. And it's what they've been doing forever. You can win. Winning is possible. And when winning is possible, change is possible. So you can do all of that. You really can. It's the only great strength, in my opinion, that these centrist political parties have is they have been very strong at convincing you can't do it, but you can do it.
Have you received any threats, any of those that's investigated and prosecuted? And I'll ask on this, in a lot of places, the police department or like the prosecutor has a police detail. How does that work with you?
So in Philly, there has always been a security detail for the chief prosecutor. The last one had 4. I have 2. Essentially, their job is just to make sure that people on the street or people at an event don't do something to you. I've actually really enjoyed being around them, and I've learned a lot from them. These are fundamentally decent people. They are Philadelphia police officers. They've taught me a lot of things I wouldn't have learned otherwise, and they've kept me safe. So that has been wonderful. Have I gotten death threats? Yes. Has anybody tried to kill me? No, not to my knowledge. And it's not unusual for a public official to get threats. I mean, the truth is, if you look at the history of the United States, very few prosecutors have ever been killed. And it is also true that very few judges have ever been killed. So I don't think we should overstate the danger. Is there maybe a little more danger in the time of the Proud Boys? Yeah, there is maybe a little bit more danger, but we're aware of it. We keep an eye on it. And what often happens if there is a threat is that we cooperate with federal authorities and they investigate. Knocking on a door and asking a few questions sometimes dissuades further bad behavior. And on those rare occasions when it doesn't, there's always the option of bringing charges. I have never pursued charges against anyone despite any of these threats, but if the time comes, I would do so.
Love that you were able to fire deputy DAs who didn't stand with your reforms. What advice do you have for progressive DAs who don't have that ability, like George Gascon?
My friend George. George is a fascinating guy. I would love to talk to you about George and his family history. Ask him sometime, because you'll find out that he's got freedom fighters in his background in 2 other countries before he got here. They really didn't know what they were doing when they made him a chief of police before he became, and he was chief of police before he became progressive prosecutor. What advice do you give to them? Well, you have to use everything that is at your disposal. I had no desire to lay off any more people than I had to. And so sometimes what you do is you are able to shift people from one job to another where they cannot do a certain kind of harm. If you believe, for example, that we have always under prosecuted wealthy people for white collar fraud, well, maybe that's where you put your hammers, and you put people with more sense into the more sensitive cases. There are, it really is a matter of local law in many instances. But I will say this: if what you're doing is Woodstock, and the way they are acting is like the KGB, sometimes the KGB isn't having a good time at Woodstock, and they will just voluntarily leave at a certain point. They'll find the music too loud. They'll find the garments to be unacceptable in their world. So sometimes they will leave. And that can be a very restorative and good thing for an organization.
And then last year, did you ever appear before, so this person is definitely an insider. Did you ever appear before the infamous judge Albert Sabo? Would you care to say anything about him and his part in this sordid criminal justice system you're detailing in your book and working to change?
I appeared briefly before the infamous Albert Sabo. The reason I was squinting was I wasn't sure which infamous judge's name you were going to name from that era. there were quite a few.
Is Sabo still a judge, or I don't know anything about Sabo?
Sabo is long gone. Okay. Let me say this. I think to some extent, one of the stories that I enjoyed telling was capturing a different infamous judge whose actual name I don't use in the book, but I refer to as D. Volo, and some of his terrifying antics. There it was at that time, and this will happen. There are some judges who in many ways are much more dangerous and predatory than some of the defendants. That's not the average judge. My wife was a judge for 19 years. I have great respect for a lot of them, but as in any group of people, there are some who are basically bullies and sadistic, and Judge D. Volo, as I refer to him in the book, was one of those. I had to try my first 5 jury trials in front of that judge, and I got to know him well. This is the kind of judge who would try to intimidate attorneys so they would never do a jury trial. They would always plead someone guilty. And so he would use tactics like screaming that they were in contempt in the middle of a trial when they'd done nothing wrong, to try to humiliate them in front of the jury. Or, he used to call me over to sidebar, and as he was growling at me and saying nasty things to me, he would start punching the side of the bench close to my head in a location where the jury could not see what he was doing. to try to unnerve me. There are people like that. And the truth is that what Judge DeVolo stood for was the idea that the greatest crime is trying your case. He had no problem giving somebody 2 years in jail for a particular crime if you pled guilty. But if you tried the case, asserted your constitutional right, and lost, he was going to give you 20. That's what we're talking about. 2 years.
What happened to him? How did he get out?
Judge DeVolo was such a remarkable judge. He accomplished a truly amazing feat. What he used to do is when you had people who showed up for jury duty and they explained that they could not serve, including one woman who showed up and said she could not serve because her religious beliefs prevented her from sitting in judgment. He would then order them to come back. He would excuse them from the jury, but he would order them to come back every day of trial and sit and watch it. This is servitude. He had absolutely no lawful basis for doing this to anyone. And so eventually an amazing thing happened, and the federal courts removed him from the bench because he was doing things that were blatantly unconstitutional. That's extremely rare, but that is an example of how crazy he was in his conduct in court.
So we only have 4 minutes left. Let me stack some of these. 2 questions about the Larry after work. What kind of music do you enjoy? And then are you able to switch off from your job when you get back home, or any night you're not being publicly interviewed about your work?
Music. I'm a big time music fan from way back. In fact, there's a playlist in this book, and each chapter begins with an excerpt from a song. Being a 60-year-old person, some of that music goes back a very long way, and there's a lot of modern music I like. But I've been referred to by family members as a jukebox because the best thing that ever happened to me is Alexa. So whatever pops up in my head, I can shout at the box, and then the music will play. So I love that. Was that it? Just the music?
When can you turn off? Like, what do you get to turn off when you go home?
I mean, a little bit, but sometimes Lisa says to me, "Are you really going to watch an action film? Are you really going to watch a movie about homicide? Really going to do that?" It's I find myself strangely falling into these patterns where I do what I do at work, and then I'm still not fascinated enough. I have to watch a fictionalized version or maybe a historical version of something relating to crime.
Is Lisa's not a judge anymore?
Lisa is a professional mediator, meaning she's essentially a private judge who gets both sides to resolve, big civil lawsuits, things of that sort.
Let me just tell you, I had to go through mediation for the last 2 days, and those mediation judges are real magicians. So shout out to Lisa. Okay, last question. What's your relationship like with other DAs in Pennsylvania and around the country whose philosophies on prosecuting crime you might find reprehensible?
Not great. It turns out they're not crazy about me and I'm not crazy about them. I mean, certainly I am more than happy to be civil and collaborative with prosecutors who are basically honest and have very different viewpoints than me. And we do that all the time. But, I deliberately withdrew from the Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association in Pennsylvania. And I should have, because what they used to do was go to the legislature when Philly was a member of this group and say, we all agree. We need to not only have the death penalty, we need drawing and quartering. We all agree, this organization, that, the hands and feet of children should be cut off if they steal a loaf of bread. They would come with these ridiculous things and would wrap our legitimacy around their illegitimate legislation. So I withdrew from that organization, and I'm looking forward fairly soon to a time in Pennsylvania when we can have a modern Pennsylvania District Attorneys Association. By the way, we were 40% of the membership of this group in terms of the number of prosecutors, and yet they only gave us a vote for 1 out of 67 counties. So frankly, the organization was always cooked to lean in the direction of those smaller jurisdictions where they make a living off of prisons.
Well, everybody, buy the book if you don't have the book. Buy the book for a friend if you do have the book. Read the book if you buy the book. Larry's the man.
Yeah, great moderating, DeRay. And Larry, after you realized the book was going to take longer than you thought, which a lot of authors eventually find out, by the way, it's a good thing you stuck with it, because now the book is out there, and it's a persuasive, story-filled critique of our criminal justice system. Congratulations. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing For the People. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.